Welcome back to John's Films, the place we do Davinci Resolve benchmarks to answer what computer should I buy for Resolve, as well as tutorials, tips, and tricks. Today we're looking at color grading from a beginner's point of view. Here I am in the color page, but color grading really starts back on the edit page because I need to make sure I get some footage added into my timeline that I'll be using. You can see I've put 4 clips into the timeline, the first one being interviews shot on a Panasonic GH5 in H.264. The next one being drone footage from California I shot on a Mavic 2 Pro. Finally, Mavic Air Pro here over Ohio at sunset. And then interview footage shot on a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K of me in my studio. There's different ways that you would grade each of these clips, and so I want to walk you through the variety so you can see not only what you might do and how you use the tool, but what you might apply to any of these individual clips. So now I click on the color page, and you'll notice I've got my clips here in the middle of the page. These are the 4 that I added. Any clips that have a segment in your timeline will have an icon here. You can adjust it, turn it on and off, with the clips toggle up at the top in case you don't see it. Next to the clips toggle, as we go through the UI, you'll notice my node graph. This is considered my node graph, and this is where you apply effects to your footage in sequence. The way nodes work, one node feeds another. So I'll hit Alt-S. Alternatively, I could just right-click, add node. That was a corrector node. And what it does, it takes the output of this node and passes it through this green line to this node. So if I took this node here and I were to change the brightness on it, exposure, and just take it all the way down, this node, when displayed, gets the same thing, really dark. But if I were then to change this node and pull it all the way back up, notice what I've got. I've got dark footage that gets fed into this node. This node then gets lifted using these primary wheels, which we'll go through in detail in a minute. And the output is actually back to an elevated picture. If I were to turn off this first node with the Control D, however, this node still raises it up. Because it didn't start at the same start point, it's now overexposed. I'm going to right-click and reset node grade on both of those nodes so that we can use them in a minute. Here, I've got a node, a corrector that I've not got connected. I'm going to grab this green dot and route my footage to it. Then I can route this footage out the end. This is the end point, and this is the begin point. So your native footage comes in here, and your colored footage goes out there. You'll notice these blue arrows as well. We'll get into those in a little bit. So let's take a look at how we would color grade this. We've got our basic nodes. We understand what they do, feeding their output to the next node, and we have the ability to adjust those nodes. First, I'm going to tidy up just a little bit. On the right here, you see my OpenFx library. This is a bunch of effects that I can apply to each of the individual nodes as I want to. We'll get into those a little bit later. To save space, I'm going to turn them off so I can move around by holding the middle mouse button down. Now, what can I do to these nodes? We saw OpenFX I can apply to them. Turn off my clips so I can get a bigger preview window out of here. And on the bottom left, this is what most likely caught your eye and what looks so cool about Davinci Resolve. It's the color wheels. The color wheels give you the ability to change portions of this image in the way that they address not only color, like you see screaming at you, but also the exposure brightness of those elements of the image. This offset wheel treats the entire image. So if I pull it up towards the top, it's going to go red. The entire image will go green. However, I'm going to reset that, and I'm going to come over here to just the lift. Now watch what happens if I use the lift. The dark elements of the screen go blue. The lighter elements of the screen tend to stay where they are or shift minimally. So I'm pulling blue into the image. You'll notice I can, if I'm very delicate about it, I can give a blue tint to her darker shirt or a more purple tint to her darker shirt without affecting her quite as much. The gamma, so lift being the darks, the gamma being the midtones, I can now change her skin and some of the green screen behind her without having to affect her. And you guessed it, the gain is just the top end, the bright highlights of the footage. Now, alternatively, I can also pull the darks down, but leave the brights up, at least as much as they will. They will drag down on each other. And for that reason, as I reset this node grade now, what you'll notice, check this out. On the right, I've got my scopes. The scopes allow me to get a visual representation of the image that I'm grading. Now, I've got the parade chart here. There's 4 or 5 different charts that I can use. The parade chart is one of my favorites because it gives me a very quick visual of how balanced the image is and how spread it is in my shoot. Here I shot this in a relatively normal color space, which means it almost looks like real life just in the color that's been recorded on the camera. So you can see, like we might expect, we're going from dead dark, which is 0, dead black, all the way up to bright white, which is 1023. I've got most of my reds as we go from left pixel all the way to the most right pixel, down near the very bottom of the darkness in the reds, and that's primarily because it's a green screen and a black shirt. Her skin, however, is what you see poking out in the middle here with some red highlights. The green and the blue is a bit more balanced for her skin tone. We'll learn how to deal with skin tones in a little bit. But the first thing I'm going to do on this image, I'm going to create a node by, again, either right-clicking Add Node or using Alt-S on your keyboard. And I'm going to name this node by right-clicking and changing the node label. We'll call this Exposure. Now, whichever genius shot this footage, oh wait, that's me, did a pretty good job of exposing it in camera, so I don't have too much to fix when it talks to exposure. I'm going to pull it up just a little bit to give myself some room. I usually am going to want skin tones to be somewhere around in between 384 and 512 here on this chart. And I'm just pulling this up so that I've got some room to work with to create more contrast in it, which is what I'll do on the next node. So this is the contrast node. You'll notice I had a keystroke. I bound the tab key when I'm in the color grade page to the node label change, which has been pretty helpful. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some more drama in this image by adding contrast. I'm going to start down in the darks with the lift, and I'm going to rotate this wheel, which changes the exposure of the bottom part of the image. I'm going to pull it down. I don't want to crush them all the way out to where you get no detail in her shirt. I want to still leave some texture there, kind of like this, where you can see some variation, leave some visual interest, but it starts to create more separation between her and her skin. I'll pull back up a little bit here in the midtones and the brights. I'm going to pull, if you pay attention to your parade chart, until I don't clip everything off. Because watch, if I do this, everything just goes bright white. There's no real difference between it. I can keep the difference and expand to reach the top of my pull. Here you might argue I'm still clipping some of my red signal, and because of that, I'll pull up just a little bit more. There we go. Finally, we have our saturation. But with this, if I come down here, saturation is on here, and I'll again use my tab shortcut to saturation. I'm labeling these nodes, and this is the genius of Davinci Resolve node graph. Because what happens if I get farther into this and I get a really, really cool grade going, but then I realize, my white balance is off. I forgot to set it at the front. What do? Well, I can always just come back here, Alt-S, add a white balance node as I want to, and it is able to handle the very beginning, so all the other color treatments go on it, or I'm able to come back and only address the contrast or only address the exposure changes that I made at the beginning without having to figure out, oh man, a big blob of changes have been made here. What do I do to fix them? And if I decide I don't like the exposure at all, I can always just reset the node grade on that one alone and then deal with it individually. The other thing that this allows us to do, we've got our saturation node. I'm going to hit Alt-P. This creates a parallel node. Now, parallel node is kind of an interesting beast. There's a layer mixer on the end of it here. So this node allows us to merge these two back together. How does it do it? Well, whatever's on the bottom goes on top. Kind of odd, but that's the way it works. So I'd like to be able to treat her skin tones to get them looking really good. She's got flawless skin to start with, by the way. Alana, if you're watching, nice skin. Up here on the top, you get your saturation. I'm not going to have that be saturation anymore. That's going to be my background. Call it back. And this we will call skin. So how do I deal with this? Well, the way you want to get the skin, you only want to affect it. You use something called a qualifier. You can get that in our middle panel. And this allows you to use your eyedropper to select out certain portions of the screen based on the hue, the saturation, and the luminance values of the pixels that you've selected. Now, I'm going to use the highlight option here so that I can see only those that I've selected. And you can see that while my qualification was pretty good, it's starting to get her hair. And now if I want to color her hair separately, or if I want to color her skin but not her hair, we're going to get a pretty funky look if I start to add some interesting stuff into it. And you can see she's now got pinkish hair and, well, terrible skin tones to start with. So what we're going to do is reset the color on that, go back into our grade by seeing our qualifier, and we're going to figure out specifically where the drop-off is so that I can get rid of her hair but keep her skin. Now what I notice is the tone of her hair might be a little brighter than the rest of her skin. So I come down to my hue and I can start sliding it back and forth to see what is in the range that encapsulates just her skin. So that got all her skin there, but it still picked up a lot of her hair. Now I'm going to trim off the bottom of the saturation values by grabbing the left side of this, get some of it out. And on the top end, we're going to see, yep, that affects her skin immediately because it's got more saturation than the hair. Pull the luminance, the darker sections, out of that a touch. And now I'm going to like this pretty well, but it's still not great. I'm still going to touch her hair. So what do? First, I denoise my selection a little bit. In fact, what I really should have done was put a denoise node, noise reduction node at the very beginning of this grade. But we're going to not do that for the moment. We'll do it in the B-raw so you can see the difference. I can try and feather out by using this subtraction selection range here, or feather right here, by going back over the elements I don't want with the minus sign, and it'll try and feather them out. But I can also use clean black, which means clean the smaller, there we go, the darker auxiliary functions around it. Clean white means kind of fill in the skin a little bit more. I'm going to go with a blur radius that allows me to blur it out a little bit. And now I've got a much softer look at her skin. Now, it's okay if I don't get all the darks in her skin because her skin is going to be, just like everything else, less saturated in the darker portions of the image. So now I'm feeling pretty good about the qualification. I probably have a little too much of her eyebrows in there. I could go back and take those out, maybe mask out the mouth if I really don't want to get the color in the inside of her mouth. But because her skin is so close to perfect, I'm not going to have to do too much here. So now let me show you how I know it's close to perfect. If I use the parade chart, I can see the mix. It's probably a bit overexposed right now. But if I come down to my Vectorscope, I can get a much better idea of exactly where her skin color falls. And all skin tones, every person on the planet has the same base tone. That same base tone is given to us by the blood in our skin. And this is a representation line of what that base tone should be. In fact, this Vectorscope gives you a visual representation of the saturation of the different colors that are in your image. This is red, magenta, blue, cyan, which is a different type of blue, green, and yellow. I want my skin tone to fall on this skin tone indicator. If you don't see it on your Vectorscope, hit the dots there and turn on skin tone indicator. I also use a 2x zoom so that I get a better view and can tell exactly what's getting affected. So that's these dots right there. Now, what I ideally would like is that this be a little bit tighter of a bundle and that it fall very closely to this line. So I'm going to start with the darks and I'm going to pull them just a little bit, a tiny little bit goes a long way, over towards the left a little, just to swing this that way. I'll go with my gamma. Now this is looking a little pinky red in her skin, and this is going to be the thing that affects her skin the most. I just pull just ever so slightly back on that. And then with the gain, I'm going to try, I think this is what's, separating us quite hard. But notice, even if I go that much, she starts to yellow. So I'll make sure not to do that far. Come back, might pull her saturation down a touch. And when I like this skin tone, I'll often come back in here and see where she stands relative to the rest of the image. She's looking a little washed out, so I'll go back to my saturation and pull it up. So in this, we need to trust not only our eyes, but also the charts. The charts don't lie. Here we are. So she's generally got a decent look. I shot this on green screen so I could put a golf course behind her. That'll be a more advanced tutorial for color grading. But here you get an idea how to isolate a color, here it's skin tones, to create new nodes, and even use a parallel node, which allows you to mix between different layers. You might also do this if you wanted to treat the darks and the lights differently. And that'll be my final grade for this one. I may punch it up a little bit more with a couple more nodes, but we're going to jump to the other clips so that you can see how you might address those. Now, this was shot on a drone flying above bright, bright day in California. I had an ND filter on this to try and tone back, it's like sunglasses, so that I can keep my footage smooth, still with the 180-degree rule. And as I move through this, notice a few things. It stays pretty bright, and if we look at the parade chart, yeah, sure enough, it's way up there. So my first node is just going to definitely be exposure. And I'm going to take that exposure, and I'm just going to pull down on everything. Just a little bit to get it somewhere I can work with it. So probably about there. And I'll tweak it more later. The darks are pretty dark already. But I need to get it in the right ballpark. And clipping off all of this surf and whatnot isn't my plan. Now, unfortunately, this was shot at an overexposed. So this surf isn't going to have any detail, no matter what I do. I can pull that all over the planet. It's still going to be dead white. So what am I going to do to try and work with this? Well, you can see that it was shot in a color profile that's got high saturation to it already. So I don't really need to deal with the saturation unless I decide I want to up some of these greens that are looking a little dingy. So maybe I want to do that. I'll up the greens a touch. The rest of my plan is probably going to be to build a little bit more mid-range contrast into it. That'll be involving moving some of this data down so it has a little bit more room for the brighter whites to pop. All right, so let's start doing that with a contrast node right here. That's my contrast node. The contrast node, as we did before, we're going to pull down on the lift, pull down on the gamma a bit. There we go. So this is pulling the midtones down towards the bottom end of this. The gain, there we go. So that's the top end, the brights. I still want to pull that down some more. Doesn't end up looking real good though, so I'm going to pull it back up. And the next thing that I'm going to do, the saturation as we talked about, is a little harsh. But there's something going on with this. There was some haze out there that day, and given that I'm looking off into a farther distance as I'm zooming into it, one of the challenges that I've got with this is I might want to, even though it'll oversaturate this, I'm going to show you how to use an effect for fun. I'm going to use the dehaze effect. When I drop it on here, it gets a little too punchy. So I can come up here on the right, and just like the inspector that you use in the cut page or the edit page to change the parameters on something, I now have my effect, and you get this OpenFx symbol here. And I can take the effect out or put it back in. I'm going to pull it down just a little bit so it doesn't get way over punched. This is definitely a pretty poppy grade. But hey, it was a really bright day and it was pretty cool. So that looks pretty good. Notice it did something interesting. It took a lot of the white out of the surf because it thought it was haze and it put a blue screen over it. So maybe what I want to do with this node, instead of letting it touch all that, I'm going to do something kind of brute force. I'm just going to hit a box, pull it up, and only let this hit my sky. So now my dehaze cleans up the sky a touch, but leaves the white down here. That is what I want. So that looks much better. There we go. Now, there's a problem with this, though. Watch what happens. As I move, well, this footage isn't actually that bad, is it? Usually, as you're going to zoom in or zoom out, what happens is the horizon changes on your picture, and you have to use what's called tracking, and you can do that here in the tracking window. So you would pick a window, you would use that window here, and you would use the window to track motion with the bounding boxes of it. But we don't need to do that right now. Just know it's there. You can go look into it in a tracking tutorial if you run into this need. Now, the last thing I said I was going to do is try and give the green a little less dingy. I can do that like we saw earlier with the qualifier and try and select out just the grass, but what I'm going to do instead is show you what happens if you go into your curves. Now, the curves are just much you're probably used to in photo editing. And it takes the darks all the way to the lights and allows you to adjust where they fall in the spectrum. You can do that by individual channel, light channel, or you can do it to all of them. There are other curves back here, though, and this is where it gets pretty interesting. I'm going to use the hue versus hue curve. What this does is allow me to select with the dropper a particular hue, and in this case, I'm selecting the grass out by clicking on the grass. Notice in my chart what it does. It selects with some bounds around it my grass. So see what I've done? I've gotten, and if I go to the extremes, I can see there's some fuzziness in there. So if I were to, looks like it's a little more yellow. There we go. I can start to adjust and get more and more stuff thrown into that. Looks like that's a pretty good one. So now what I want to do is move around until I find something that's putting more green into my footage. There we go. Hey, that's pretty good. Might want to move over just a little bit more. Try and capture up some of these spots right there. So that's that. There we go. So now I'm really getting a good pop out of that green, and it starts to match the rest of the image, which is really saturated, and the green just looking dingy wasn't great. Now I'm going to hit Control F to show you something else. Boom, full screen. Looks pretty good. Again, this is a really poppy grade. Nothing wrong with it. And that's the beauty of color grading. This is up to you. Somebody else says you suck at it, so what? You're here to have fun. You want to find out what you think looks good? Do this for you, man. Make it cool. All right, now the next clip that we're going to look at, if I go back up to my clips, is going to be that drone footage. And this was seriously a Mavic Air, original Mavic Air, and it was pretty dark. So this was after I'd been shooting a bunch of windmills flying around at sunset. Looked awesome, but now we're talking about, it's kind of dark. The sensor's picking up some noise. So I'll show you how to use noise reduction. Now this is available on the left-hand panel. It's available only in the studio version. Can you use it? I do have a video on how to create noise reduction in the free version. It's a bit more advanced. It's a Fusion tutorial, but if you've got the free version, it might be worth your time. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say, let's treat temporal noise reduction. This is time-based noise reduction, meaning from frame to frame. So how many frames do I want it to compare at once? If you aren't working on the world's greatest hardware over there, you using this, it can get painful fast. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to choose 3. I have a pretty killer editing rig. You may want to use just 1 or 2 nodes. So here we go with the noise reduction. And I will then choose a better motion estimation type. And my motion is pretty large. I'm moving throughout this. In fact, I'm even panning through this. Now I'm going to treat the 2 different types of noise that exist, luma, that being the light noise, and the chroma, the color noise. I'm going to pull that up to about 5.6. Kazi Man, who is a professional color grader that teaches color grading, kind of has this tip in one of his tutorials, and it seems to work for me pretty well, which is somewhere around 5.6 for both of them in temporal and spatial, that is comparing each individual pixel to the pixels next to it. The chroma is the color, and that's where you really start to see problems with it. So pump that up to about 5.6 or somewhere around there as well, and give it a test. I'm going to go with spatial, again, enhanced, and a larger radius, meaning look out at more pixels at once. And now what I'm able to do, when I say noise, you see all this? That's the noise. So if I were to disable this node, you don't notice a difference. But as I start to play it, it's still pretty fuzzy. But when I back out, it's quite a bit cleaner than if I disable the node again and play this back. You see all this dancing? The dancing is what we can get rid of. So here we go without the dancing. Much less of that dancing, especially what I was seeing in the reds and whatnot. Now this is a pretty rough case for noise reduction in that this is a really small sensor, a 2/3 inch sensor on this drone. It's shooting in a 100 megabit color space. And so it's really going to struggle, but using noise reduction here in Davinci Resolve, it does do a great job. You can also increase motion blur, but I prefer not to use that. It tends to make it look a little bit more cinematic until you overdo it, and then people wonder why you're so crazy. But hey, again, you like you. Don't let anybody yuck your yum. All right. Next up, I'm going to set the white balance on this image. I've got a beautiful pink glow coming off the building here. I really don't want to mess with this much. I'm going to see what happens if I choose to set white balance, and I would do that over here on my color wheels. The bottom left-hand corner, click that eyedropper with the drop next to it. I'm going to pick the side of that building, and what we're going to see, sure enough, it made it quite blue. Just because I want to balance that into a white building doesn't mean I have to go with this grade. Most people, when they attack color grading, they first color correct, that is to put it back to a normal space. That would be as if you shot it, and then to treat or color grade, that is to apply artistic license to it to give a feel to the footage. In this case, I can see as I'm color correcting, setting the white balance so that's truly a white barn, it really doesn't go in the direction that I know I'm going to want to go in my creative grade, and it will actually be detrimental. So I'll skip it. I'm not going to do it. What do you know? Next thing I'm going to do is add some contrast to this. It was pretty dark, and I want to be able to show that in the footage. I can do that by making sure my darks really do come across dark in the shade. This is also another way, if you watch some YouTube tutorials, they'll tell you, boom, how to get rid of noise. Well, yeah, you also got rid of any level of detail and any level of contrast in my footage, but hey. So here we go. I don't want to crush the blacks too much. I just want to give the idea that it's darker. And then I'm going to get really excited as we pull these highlights up. That pink glow, that was just amazing. So that was my node label contrast. And after contrast, Alt-S, I'm going to go, let's see, I'd like to create some focal interest over here. And the pink is really doing it for me off the barn there. So I wonder if I wouldn't want to, you know what we'll do? We're going to use, let's try that dehaze again, see what we get out of that. Get a bit more color out of it, okay? Alternatively, I could have done some saturation, and I think I'm going to try that instead. Let's see what we get out of that. So saturation on that node, pop it up. I like the variability in the field. I don't like the yellowish tinge that it's giving me. So I'm going to pull it back down. And a little goes a long way with saturation, by the way. Your eyes can fool you after a while. You're looking at it, you're like, yeah, I'll edge it up a little more, edge it up a little more. You get done, and all of a sudden, people's eyes get burned out because of the brightness of that. It's almost one of those things you walk away and come back and look at again and go, oh, okay, that was a little aggressive. All right, I do like the depth that the dehaze gives to the sky. So I'm going to tone it back down on the saturation just a touch, and then I'm going to leave the dehaze. I think that looks pretty good. Finally, I want to show you how to single out an area of your footage and maybe use a different effect. So in this case, I want to single out, but very softly, the barn. I want that to be my focal point. Now, there's two different dots here in controls. One is the size, and I can adjust the size on all sides, either sideways to go oblong, which I need to do in this a little bit, shrink that down a touch. The other red dots you see here are the feathering. So I'm going to feather this out pretty hard. I don't want it to be obvious. I just put a ring around that. I'm going to pull up on the gain just a touch. I want that to be a little bit brighter than everything else. And I'll Alt-S again so that you can see it did make a bit of a difference. Here you go. It is quite slight, but there's just a little bit of an uptick on that. I'm also going to use that mask in this next node. Well, we're finally going to answer the question, what are these blue things for? If I do that and I copy this forward like that, the mask, that is the gray areas you see there, get copied over into this node as well. So now that I've copied the mask over, if I change something in this node, it only affects the area that was previously masked out and handed over from the blue area. All right, let's reset that node for a second in the color. There we go. So now I'm going to use this to take my highlights and give them just a little bit extra of that pinkish tinge because I like it. It's color grades about me. It's probably too much, so I can pull that back a little bit. Maybe I want to mix it between my gamma and my gain. Not bad. Not terrible, not great. Mess with it longer, or you get the point. Now I can hit Alt-S. Now I want to do something interesting here. I think I really would like to see a lens flare on this. So I just drag it, drop it on top. Now I have a position. I'm going to put even off the screenish over here. Maybe right up in the edge, so that you barely get it coming on. And what I'll be doing with this is changing the positions. You can see I can modify it here on the left, but also the aperture and the elements in the aperture. Controls for the flare spot, which is, this is the flare spot. Controls for my starburst, which is some of these, which is the actual burst that goes around it. So you can see I'll change that. Whee! To make huge light rays if I wanted to. And I really don't even want that on the screen. So what I really want to do, I don't need to mess with the star. I want the ghosting. I want to change the position of the ghosts. You can see this one is a big one, which is right in front. Put it there. And I'm going to now change the flare spot so that it goes back off the screen. Pulling it off screen. And then I'm going to come back down and use my elements to find the last ghosting down here, the one that was really cool. Looks like that one's not in. Whoops. No, thank you. As you see, there's a lot to do here. Let's see. I don't even have Ghost 5. I have Ghost 2. And let's change the position on that so it comes. Can we see it? Size. There it is. So it was up in this area. Not so great. Center brightness. There we go. Edge brightness. So it's right there. Now we're going to go to Ghost 3. This one's more pinkish. And we will move him around a bit. Let's get him brighter so I can see him. There he is. All right. A little brighter. There he is. Yeah. All right. And let's see what his edge looks like. Oh, that's kind of cool. Now remember, all of this is your choice. So I'm jacking with it here. It could be hideous. In fact, this probably isn't what I'd end up doing to this footage. The other thing that I'm going to want to do now, notice that I've got that lens flare, but watch what happens as the lens source changes. The lens flare does not. So to edit that, here's what I would probably do. If I didn't track the footage with the camera tracker and try and calculate how that moves, which is a studio-only feature, what I will do is I will use keyframing. So I know the position of this most visible flare. I hit the diamond here on the right. And now what I'm able to do is use my keyframe section down here. And this diamond allows me to change over time where I want this to show up. So if I were to change this all the way to the end, this flare should probably move out kind of in this direction. So now what I'm going to do is scooch it in at this point. And what this did was allow me to, and I don't want to go through that too fast. You turn it on the right-hand side, hit that diamond so it's red. That sets what it's called a keyframe. And it says, hey, when you're at this point right here in the timeline, I want the position to be 1.47. Later, when I get all the way over here, at this position, I want the position to be, at this spot in the timeline, I want the position to be 0.826. So watch what happens when we play it back. It's moving back towards, and this number keeps going down. So as we play this back, and I'm going to turn off noise reduction, like I said, it can be a bit of a bear. That's Control-D to turn that off, by the way. And now when I play it, watch this move as it goes across the screen. Now, I'd probably keyframe this one, which is number 2 as well, so that it moved off the screen with it more accurately like it would do if it were actually a lens flare. All right, let's jump to our last clip here. This is B-raw. As you can tell, it's probably 5 in the morning I'm filming this. There we go. All right, so this B-raw Man, that looks really flat compared to all the other footage I edited. That's because it was shot in what's called a log or logarithmic format for the color space. And what that does is it compresses the highlights and the darks so that it can capture a larger dynamic range. This means that all of my color data is going to be a little bit more compressed together with an algorithm that allows it to be expanded later. So my job, now that I've been able to pull this footage in, is to edit this to expand it. This is especially helpful with raw footage where you have a lot more data to play with. If I were working in some of this type of footage and I were to try and push something just a little too far, you can see it blows out pretty darn quickly. And if I really get color crazy, it starts to break the image up. It's just really terrible. However, because I've shot this in RAW, I have a ton of options to play with here. Now, I'm going to show you the trick that I showed in the video that got this one going, and that is to click on my gallery, and now I'm going to apply a grade that I've saved, and it's a node graph. Check that out. Boom, we go from perfectly flat to a grade. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to apply grade. That video's linked above if you'd like to see how these things work. I'll hide my settings, OpenFx, and my clips so we get a little bit more space here. But this is a full color grade on my studio. I save this over here at all times because when I shoot in my studio, I pretty much use the same exact grade pattern. Not always the same exact grade. We'll see, I'll tweak it in a second. But I use the same pattern of nodes to be able to treat this footage, and I don't want to have to recreate this every time. That's why I've created this gallery by right-click, grab still, and saving it. Okay, you can also put this in a power bin, but that's a note for another day. So we'll start here. I've got noise reduction turned on. I'm going to right-click on it, and I've got my node cache turned on as well. That means once it generates it once in my session here, I'm not going to have to regenerate that node. It also takes out any variability or any noise that I've got in the image so that I'm treating a very clean image. That's why it goes up near the front. The second thing that goes up near the front is your white balance. If you're using a color correction card, this is what you're going to want to treat it with. Or if you're just using the air conditioner in the back corner, this is where you go up and say, hey, boom, that should be true white. And I got a little bit of a change because I'm applying this from one shot to another. Next thing, a corrective LUT. Well, what's a LUT? A LUT is a lookup table. Lookup table is a saved direction for a node of what it needs to do with color, exposure, and everything else that you've saved into it. In this case, I have a LUT browser, and this is really cool with Davinci Resolve. So you have a LUT browser that you're able to use to mouse over and see what that LUT would do to your footage. Here, I'm going to apply, I've got a corrective LUT applied. I'll reset that node grade, and you can see the change that comes out. The saturation goes down, the contrast is a little bit different. I'm going to reapply that corrective LUT by going to where I keep it, which is camera specific Blackmagic Design. And here I've got it saved as a favorite. So I can filter with the favorites here. And now I will drag and drop this directly onto that node. The little grid down here tells me that the corrective LUT has been applied. This is what I would consider a color corrected image. It has its white balance set, the noise reduction is done and clean, and I've applied Blackmagic Design's provided 4K film to Rec 709. Again, Rec 709 is the broadcast standard for color here in my viewer. I now want to give it my look, my studio look. And so I'm going to give it a little bit more contrast. Let me get rid of the gallery and the LUTs so we get a bit more space. There we go. I'm going to give it a little bit more contrast. Kind of down near the bottom, I like to pull the skin tones up and the entire thing. So again, I'm going to go to my gamma and pull up just a little bit. There we go. A little lighter. Maybe not that much. And that's my contrast. Now I'm going to go into my background and my skin tones. Now we used these on Alana earlier when we were working with her. She had great skin tones. Mine's a little washed out at the moment. Probably a little bright there. So we want to be able to treat that. Now the grade from the prior clip that I used this on is there, and it's close, but it's not perfect. So let's just grab a new one. I'm going to grab it with my qualifier. See what we can do here. Hey, that worked pretty well right off. One of the major reasons that's the case, there's more variability in color, saturation, and luminance in the raw footage than there is in the H.264 we were grading with Alana. This is why cinema cameras are much better for this type of work. You've got a lot more data to play with. Now all I need to do is tweak it just a touch. Don't want to get my hair in there, because my hair turns pretty orange pretty darn fast. And we're going to tweak just a little bit there. And on the saturation, don't need the desaturated parts quite as much. I'll give it a little bit more clean on the black to get rid of maybe that right there. Alternatively, I could put a mask over it or a window. I'll clean the white just to get my nose in there a little bit more and blur it a touch, and there we go. We've got a pretty good qualification on this. I would like to get rid of that a little bit more, etc., but that's not the point of this tutorial. Now what I'm going to do, as we saw before, I go into my Vectorscope. I'm almost dead on there. In fact, I'm right on it. I would like to give myself a little bit more life because this color grade is going to be a little going. So I'm going to pop up just a touch in the lift and the gamma in the red-pink area. Just, I mean, ever so slightly, 0.01 right here. This one didn't even move. And this is why I like my color panel, because I'm able to tweak it very carefully without having to go all crazy with the mouse here. See, one step too far and boom, you're pink. So let's see. That's probably good enough. I always like to check by looking. And here we go. I look a little orangey maybe. Let's see what this does. We'll go back here. That's right on the right side of it where I want to see it. It may be that oh, that goes yellow pretty fast. So you can watch just moving this gain a tick, and we'll move it so you can see in the Vectorscope on the right. Woo, it flies all over the place, moving it very, very strong. And it's a fine line between your yellow-green Martian and you're a bright red angry cartoon. So you got to be really careful with that. One of the tricks I like to do is to get it to where I think the skin tone's good and it's bright reddish more than I want, and then just take the saturation down on that node and see what that looks like. Looks pretty good for skin tones. I'm pretty happy with that. The blue eyes, I could make them pop by now treating that with a color balance and putting some more blue into it. I'm thinking I kind of like the way this is looking. I would like to put a different look into the background behind my skin. And I can do that by either, we saw earlier, a LUT. Let's see what it looks like if I drop a LUT in here. And the drive LUT tends to look pretty decent. Now what you'll notice here, this really hit it hard. Man, that's a lot of LUT look. I put my color skin back in. Notice it goes a little bland right there, but because I've stacked it in this parallel node in the node mixer, puts a little bit more color into it. I don't want quite as much of the LUT to apply, so I click on that node. I go to my mask page right here, so that's this node page key, and I'm able to take the key output and lower it quite a bit. Now it looks like it's hazing out everything, but what it's really doing is only hazing out this node, so that when I come here, it's not applied quite as much. So that's a look I kind of like. It's kind of steely in the back. It pops me off the page a bit more. I would like to get a little bit crisper here. So how do I do that? Well, step one would be to shoot it in focus. But step two is to cheat a little. That means we come over to this blur page and we just pull down ever so slightly. Now that just crisped up everything. More ideally, I'm going to put a mask on that so that it only affects my face and the parts of my shoulders that are in focus there. So now it's going to be a little bit better because I gotta activate that node. There we go. Now it's just focused on this area, and it adds a little bit of sharpness there that actually does become noticeable in the end product. The difference here, you have to be very light-handed with it. If you go crazy on this, and 4.6 is probably too much, 4.7 is about right, it will really start to look gross. Finally, a vignette. I would like to put a vignette on this. Let's see what we do with that. So we grab a mask, we put it in here, pull it out. I'm going to pull it out this way, and then I'm going to feather it quite a bit. There we go. And now I'm going to notice which portion of my image is affected. Yeah, well, that's the part I actually want to touch. So I'm going to invert it, And now I'll grab this wheel and just pull it down a little bit. That's the offset wheel, taking everything in those corners down just a touch. Now you can see the colors, the corners go down a touch. I'm even more highlighted in the image. Finally, if I wanted to put some lighting, spotlighting over me in some reason, it's there. And the final is any open effects that I might want to use, or any colors, or anything else I want to tweak about it. So this has been an intro to color grading. I hope I've covered 4 different types of grades for you, and I hope you've gotten a lot out of it, the different types of nodes and the different ways that you might color grade. This is a beginner's tutorial, but there's a lot here, so feel free to go back, pause, stop, and maybe you want to watch only part of it at a time. But hopefully it is helpful for you. I appreciate you watching the channel. Thank you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and have a great day.